Podmates, this is Ori again. Welcome to episode 11 of OrcaPod, a deep dive into DeFi from the builder's perspective. So it's a bear market and people are getting excited about a couple of new L1s on the scene. In particular, over at Orca, I've been getting some questions along the lines of, is Orca ever going to launch on Sui or Aptos? Meanwhile, I've also noticed that when you Google the different kinds of L1 blockchains, the quality of information is pretty disappointing, to say the least. I think it's actually quite hard for people who are just getting started in this space to actually tell what the real differences are between different L1s. And so, with Solana Breakpoint, the annual Solana conference, just on the horizon, I'm excited to welcome back my co-founder and resident blockchain big brain, Yutaro Mori, aka Raw Falafel on Twitter, to get an expert's take on the different L1 blockchains and whether Orca would ever go multi-chain. So, without further ado, Yutaro, welcome to the show.
Hey all, excited to be back on the OrcaPod.
So before we jump really deep into all these different L1s, why raw falafel? Are you just a really big fan of raw chickpeas with herbs mixed in?
Well, yeah, coming at me with the really hard-hitting questions, Ori.
Just easing you in.
Happy to answer this, yeah. I don't think it's actually that interesting of a story, but when I think I was in middle school or high school, my gaming tag used to be Raffle Waffle, like rolling on the floor, laughing, and waffle, the breakfast food. And I think someone just pointed out that raw falafel was also a homonym for Raffle Waffle. And I thought that was cute. And there's not much more to it than that. It just sounds fun.
A fateful day. Well, I will say that raw falafel is far more gluten-free and various diet-friendly than Raffle Waffle, so perhaps you're just ahead of the progressive curve.
That's true.
Feeling further discussion of waffles and falafels, I think we can get into the actual crypto stuff now. And so I wanted to start out by just answering a question that one person on Twitter kindly offered when I said that we would consider doing a podcast of this nature, and they thought it'd be helpful to just start with some quick definitions. So why don't we go with that? Taro, what is a layer 1 blockchain?
Sure. So I would say a layer 1 blockchain is, let's see. So the L1 part signals, I suppose, that it is a blockchain with its own consensus protocol. So what that means is that there are validators for this blockchain that determine what kind of transactions or what kind of data go into kind of every single block in the blockchain, and that, these validators are specifically for this blockchain. So what does that actually mean? I would say what that actually means is that this blockchain kind of has sovereignty over how blocks are produced in the blockchain.
Right. So I think that's a pretty good technical description. I'd say kind of on a high level for most people, would you say it's fair to consider these blockchains essentially also developer ecosystems where folks generally choose to build on essentially like EVM chains or a specific other L1 chain?
Yeah, so maybe it would be easier to kind of like point out what is an L1 blockchain. We haven't really gotten to this yet, but like the definition L1 blockchain only exists because L2 blockchains exist, or like people call things L2 blockchains. So maybe we can kind of just talk about like the difference between the two and kind of examples of each.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so an L2, I suppose, blockchain or an L2 is something that is relying on the consensus protocol of a particular L1 blockchain in order to kind of like produce blocks with transactions inside of them. So I think the most classic example would be something like Optimism, which uses an optimistic rollup on top of the Ethereum mainnet to kind of like, allow people to submit transactions and whatnot.
So you would say the difference between an L1 and an L2 is essentially that like an L2 is a layer on top of the L1 that kind of rolls these transactions back down onto the L1, where it depends on the L1's consensus mechanism to actually confirm that on the blockchain.
Exactly.
Right. And I would say that in terms of history, the reason even for L2's existence is essentially to scale L1s, right? I think there was a time when Ethereum was starting to become really popular. DeFi summer, around summer 2020 is often, I think, the time that people really started paying attention to scale in a new way when it came to blockchains. And so L2s were one of many potential mechanisms that people considered as a way to essentially allow L1s to achieve greater scale and performance.
Yeah, exactly. So like the reason why even the idea of an L2 exists is because, there is this idea out there that there's kind of this a limit to how much throughput you can get inside of an L1 blockchain. And if we want to kind of like have blockchains be globally useful, obviously we need kind of even more transaction throughput than what an L1 allows. And therefore, it's kind of natural to try and build on top of an L1 to increase throughput. So, if we're talking about, let's say, Bitcoin, famously, it can do like 5 to 8 transactions per second globally. And the Lightning Network is essentially kind of a mechanism built on top of Bitcoin that allows theoretically transactions to, be much higher than 5 to 8 transactions per second. So in that sense, the Lightning Network is, you can consider it like an L2 for Bitcoin. The kind of definition that I gave earlier, which is that, an L2 relies on the consensus protocol of an L1 applies here with the Lightning Network. The Lightning Network doesn't have its own consensus protocol. It relies on Bitcoin's consensus protocol for its security. Similarly, I would say Optimism has kind of the exact same idea. And actually, like the technical implementation has it's not identical, but it has a lot of similarities to the Lightning Network. It relies on the consensus protocol for Ethereum for its security, but because it's built on top of it, it's designed in such a way that it can support way more transactions per second than the Ethereum network can.
Precisely. I think that's a pretty good summary. And I was actually going to suggest that we actually just go through the most famous blockchains one by one and just talk about what the differences are as briefly as possible. So I think you're a step ahead of me, but why don't we just start again with Bitcoin? What is Bitcoin? Is that an L1? And why would you not choose to build on Bitcoin or the Lightning Network?
Yeah, so I would say Bitcoin is definitely the OG L1. It, of course, kind of has its own set of validators. It has its own consensus protocol, which I guess it's called like the Nakamoto consensus protocol or something like that, which, of course, kind of uses proof of work for it to work. And I suppose the reason why we have not built on top of it and there isn't much of a developer ecosystem on top of Bitcoin is that it just wasn't really designed for there to be a developer ecosystem built on top of it. It was really just designed for simple transactions from one person to another, and the design is really optimized for that. Folks have tried to kind of like make certain modifications to Bitcoin to support kind of like more general programming on top of it. But the fact that it wasn't really designed for it makes it generally difficult to, build applications like ours.
Yeah, I would say I'm a latecomer to the crypto space. I only really started getting involved when I met you in 2020. But looking back, having read a few books on just like the history of Bitcoin and kind of looking in from the outside, I've got to say that folks who really are still kind of Bitcoin maxis in the sense that they want Bitcoin to support a developer ecosystem seem a little bit crazy. Like it's just trying to hang on to some relic of the past out of more sentimentality than actual practicality. But what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like crypto is kind of like I feel like there's an allegory out there about like the elephant in a dark room and then there's like, 5 different people that are like trying to figure out what this elephant in a pitch black room is. And, one person is like touching the trunk and they say like, oh, it's like so and so, and then another person is like touching the tail and there's like, oh, it's something else. And I feel like crypto is kind of like that where there are different people that are like looking at or focusing on different aspects of it and then making conclusions about the entire thing. And that's why, different people can have completely different ideas about like, what crypto should be or, whether or not like Bitcoin should be the one and only crypto and whatnot. That's kind of how I see things. And, I would say for me personally, I see it primarily as this like evolving technology. And Bitcoin was kind of just like the first step. But, others have different opinions.
Yeah. Personally, I buy the digital gold thesis and that it does share a lot of the same properties as gold. And I can see why it's a compelling store of value. But personally, I think even the environmental impacts of proof of work are pretty reasonable criticism that a lot of people throw at Bitcoin. And that alone makes me feel like if there are better alternatives and when it comes to crypto, which I think there are and we'll discuss shortly, there's no reason to continue depending on Bitcoin forever. But that's a bit of a controversial point of view, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say it's like becoming less and less controversial. I would say like even 3 years ago, kind of Bitcoin versus Ethereum was kind of a huge lightning rod for kind of controversy, and so many people were debating about it so seriously. But you really don't even see that debate anymore, right? Like, at least for me personally, like, I don't see Bitcoin maxis or Bitcoin maximalists as much on Twitter or just like in conversation in general. So, yeah.
Maybe they're just hiding in Puerto Rico,
Yeah, maybe they are. Yeah.
just chilling, living on the beach. But I think this is actually a good segue into Ethereum. Let's talk about Ethereum 1 starting out. I think this one's especially interesting because you have a background as actually working, it's actually full-time, I guess, as a contributor to the Ethereum Foundation, right? And even worked on the ETH2 Golang client. So tell us about Ethereum. What is Ethereum and why do people still, even today, choose to build on Ethereum?
Yeah. So Ethereum is the original blockchain for smart contracts. Maybe not like the very, very first, but it is definitely the first that, actually went to mainnet with a usable product and kind of found product market fit as a developer ecosystem or a developer platform. And yeah, I mean, originally it was just conceived. Interestingly, originally the idea was to build this on top of Bitcoin, but then essentially that required some modifications to the Bitcoin kind of core protocol. And essentially, I suppose the folks that, had sway in the direction of Bitcoin at the time didn't think it was a good idea to make these changes. So then the original creator of Ethereum decided that, the only way to develop or to build a smart contract blockchain was to kind of start a new one. And so that's essentially what Ethereum became. And so I would think of Ethereum as kind of like the OG smart contract blockchain.
Gotcha. And ETH1 versus ETH2, let's talk about that.
Sure. So I think at the core, the difference between ETH1 and ETH2 is that ETH1 uses proof of work, which requires, basically like GPUs or ASICs to kind of do this like particular computation over and over again in order to produce blocks. And ETH2 uses proof of stake, which does not use any computation, but requires kind of staked ether in order to produce blocks. And so one is that, so there are two advantages, I would say, for proof of stake. The first one is that it is generally more secure in the sense that it is generally more secure from the perspective of preventing malicious validators from essentially messing with the chain. The second thing, of course, is that it is much more energy efficient.
Right. So ETH2, definitely an improvement on ETH1 in terms of like the security, in terms of, I guess, efficiency, but still not sufficient to scale Ethereum on its own, right?
Yeah, so interestingly, ETH2 basically does not bring any meaningful throughput improvements. In terms of kind of the amount of transactions per second, ETH2 can support, it's not really any different from ETH1.
And that's exactly why we have layer twos, right? So tell me about your views on Polygon. What is Polygon? Would you ever build on it? Why or why not?
Yeah, so I suppose Polygon is an interesting one. These are not my words. These are kind of what other people have said. It has great biz dev practices, but not so good tech. And I would say, kind of from a distance, that seems relatively true. So I may get flamed for this from someone on the Polygon team, but my understanding is that Polygon is essentially more or less kind of this like fairly centralized sidechain that allows kind of like transactions or anything that is going on within Polygon to kind of settle on the Ethereum main chain. So there's kind of like some nuance here between maybe what Polygon is, which is, I would say a sidechain, and what an L2 may be. An L2, I would say, is essentially fully secured by the L1. A sidechain is not necessarily fully secured by an L1. And I would say, kind of Polygon falls into that category.
And just one more time then to really kind of clarify, I think, for our audience. What's the difference between a sidechain and an L2?
So the difference is that in an L2, the transactions that happen on an L2, the transactions are kind of like a checkpoint is created for kind of the transactions that happen on an L2. And the checkpoint is submitted on the L1 in a way that's like relatively secure. With a sidechain, that mechanism doesn't really happen. But because that mechanism doesn't happen, it's a lot simpler and allows kind of like the theoretically for a sidechain to have kind of more transaction throughput.
All right, Polygon folks, if you have any rebuttals, we'll be waiting in the comments on Twitter. But I think it's time to move on to another well-known L2 or essentially Ethereum scaling solution. So Avalanche or AVAX. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. I mean, going back to Polygon, though, I think Polygon to me kind of falls in a similar category as Binance Smart Chain in that it is a centralized temporary solution to the scalability problem in the sense that Binance Smart Chain and Polygon, I'm not saying the technology is exactly the same, but basically what they're doing is they're saying, right now, Ethereum, it doesn't scale. And the only way that it can scale right now is for there to be kind of a fairly centralized solution. And yeah, that's kind of how I see both of those, Polygon and Binance Smart Chain.
This is a good opportunity to actually call out the scalability trilemma. So if I remember correctly, this was actually originally proposed by Vitalik himself, the original creator of Ethereum, as essentially a problem that these blockchains have to overcome in order to improve basically scalability and the ability to handle tons of transactions. And the idea is that you basically can have scalability, security, or decentralization. You can pick two of three, but you can't have them all. And generally something has to go. And so in the case of these more kind of walled garden environments like BSC, and I guess you're saying Polygon, essentially what they're letting go of is decentralization in favor of scalability and security. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would also add that the idea of a scalability trilemma, it was probably introduced in like 2018 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it was definitely true that there was this trilemma and you had to pick two of three, but not all three. To me, at least, and maybe we're kind of like getting ahead of ourselves here, I would say that what makes Solana interesting is that it actually kind of showcases the fact that like the scalability trilemma, at least the way we understood it in 2018, was not particularly true. And that actually is possible to increase throughput without sacrificing the other two qualities that, we care about in a blockchain.
Which is exactly why we built Orca on Solana.
Yeah.
But I do think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. I still want to back up and make sure that we can answer the question that I posed around Avalanche.
Sure. So Avalanche, I would say, is the main innovation or the main thing that differentiates Avalanche from other L1s, and it is an L1, is that it has kind of a novel consensus protocol. However, at least to me, it is not particularly interesting because the consensus protocol doesn't necessarily allow the transaction throughput to be meaningfully higher than Ethereum. So we kind of see that in practice with the performance that Avalanche has had on mainnet. Avalanche's transaction throughput is not meaningfully different from Ethereum's. And then we also see that Avalanche is going with essentially kind of a sharded blockchain approach, which is essentially signaling that they believe that they can't improve transaction throughput on a single chain much more than where they're at right now.
Right. So I think that's actually, it's a good correction because I referred to it as an L2, but it's really another L1 that just happens to be compatible with the Ethereum virtual machine. So I think that's like a really interesting kind of different angle for someone who's just coming to start understanding just a comparison of the different blockchains. Is I think essentially EVM compatible versus not EVM compatible is also quite a point of contention. So tell us about that. First of all, what is the EVM and why would someone want a chain to be EVM compatible?
Sure. So the EVM stands for Ethereum Virtual Machine, and it is, how do I define virtual machine without calling it a virtual machine? So it's essentially the computing architecture that is used for kind of smart contracts on Ethereum. And of course, it was originally designed for Ethereum. It's similar to, like, for example, the JavaScript that runs on our website. There's kind of a virtual machine that executes the JavaScript and, allows the logic on websites to happen. Similarly, there's a virtual machine on the Ethereum blockchain that allows smart contracts to execute.
Right. And EVM compatibility.
Yeah.
A lot of people essentially like that fact that they can keep writing Solidity, right? So what's Solidity?
Yeah, so Solidity is simply the programming language that can be used to write smart contracts that can be executed on the EVM. So yeah, if we go back to JavaScript, JavaScript is kind of like Solidity, And then V8, which is, I believe, the JavaScript engine that Chromium uses, is kind of like the EVM. And so that's the platform on which the programming language runs on top of.
Right. And that's why I feel like people can get pretty tribal when it comes to these different blockchain ecosystems, is that you have folks who started building essentially on Ethereum and started writing all their smart contracts in Solidity. And there is such an incredible wealth of developer tooling, of existing architecture, and of existing smart contracts on Ethereum. And because of the promise of DeFi Legos, where people essentially want to be composing these different smart contracts in order to create more complicated and potentially more useful applications on top of blockchains, a lot of people don't really want to let go of what's been created on Ethereum already, which you have to some degree if you're going to be building in a totally different virtual machine, right? Like the Solana virtual machine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sympathetic to the view that a lot of smart contracts have been written in Solidity and the EVM, and therefore it has enough network effects that, even if there is kind of a new virtual machine that might be kind of like better than the EVM, Solidity and the EVM will just win in the end. Essentially, a similar thing happened with, I'm going to go back to JavaScript because actually a lot of people reference JavaScript as language for the web platform that essentially won in the end, even though it's not a perfect language. And yeah, with the web, I think there was a point at which a lot of large companies felt that JavaScript was just like not a good enough language to continue to be used on the web. And folks tried to kind of like create essentially a new standard. I think Google tried to develop, I believe, Dart, but Dart never got adoption. And then JavaScript eventually evolved into like TypeScript, and React as a framework got developed, and eventually JavaScript won. So seeing that, a lot of people say, well, like a similar thing is going to happen to Solidity and the EVM. But, I personally think that won't be the case.
And personally, as someone who's been writing JavaScript for over 10 years, it is such an incredibly shit language. Like, I think it's kind of okay for most web applications. And I mean, you even see this today, even like banking applications, they just freeze all the time, right? If you open up the console on an average website, you just get like hella JavaScript errors. But that's generally pretty fine because if your web page freezes or doesn't work in this way or that, it's not that huge of a deal, right? But then if it's a smart contract handling potentially billions of dollars, like the requirements are just pretty different, right?
Yeah. And I would also say that with JavaScript kind of had Moore's Law on its back, or as like wind on its back, to kind of like carry it through to where it is now, where, JavaScript evolved into TypeScript. And then we had these like relatively sophisticated frameworks like React that, just would not have been possible with the computing power in a decade ago or 20 years ago. And so that allowed kind of JavaScript to evolve, but, not be fully ripped out. And that's, in my view, kind of like one of the key reasons why JavaScript still exists today. I think that that doesn't really apply for kind of like smart contract languages and smart contracts as a platform, because fundamentally Moore's law just like doesn't really apply in the same way. We're going to see like continual improvements to hardware, but we're not going to see kind of like exponential improvements in the way that we have seen with the web platform over the last, 2 to 3 decades.
Yeah, no, I mean, for what it's worth, I'm obviously on board, but you're preaching to the choir. So while we're preaching, I think we can do the next few lightning round style. I think Bitcoin and Ethereum deserve a little bit more explanation because they're essentially like the OG and the OG plus one chains. But there's a lot of other ones that people may have heard of. And so I think for the next couple that I'm going to mention, just give me your like one sentence assertion of what is it and why do we choose not to build on this. So let's start actually with a couple L1s that made big claims and then essentially died or went away after the last round. So Definity, tell me about this.
Ooh, I feel like I could, yeah, so Definity, Definity, I think it was actually quite interesting initially, but it focused too much on R&D and less on practicality. And eventually it took like 3 to 4 years to launch. And by then it was this product that no one really cared about. So I feel like it did this like classic startup mistake of not launching an MVP and, not understanding what users, or in this case, developers, actually cared about.
Yeah, move fast and break things, I think, is honestly like a pretty good startup mentality, as long as you're not breaking the core smart contracts or making them hackable. Okay, EOS.
I think it had similar problems or so, I think ultimately what we know now in hindsight is that what really matters is high transaction throughput, sufficient decentralization on a single chain. And it had some interesting ideas, I suppose, but it was not sufficiently decentralized and it was also just not particularly fast.
All right, so while we're talking about skeletons, I think let's talk about a zombie that is sort of a skeleton, but still kind of here haunting us. So XRP is still the number 6 top cryptocurrency by market cap. And I know you have strong feelings about Ripple, so give me your one-liner.
Yeah, I would say that XRP has definitely found product market fit as a token that investors want to buy. It definitely has not found product market fit as a blockchain that users want to use.
Yeah, I remember a good friend of mine who essentially has never otherwise touched crypto saying that Ripple to him was like magic because it was the fastest way he ever turned $200 into $0. But why don't we leave it at that and go on to something that's actually not really exactly an L1 or an L2 in the same way, right? Cosmos, and it's definitely still on the scene.
Yeah, so I think Cosmos is interesting and it has definitely introduced a lot of neat ideas. But essentially, what Cosmos is a build your own blockchain software development kit. And the reason why Cosmos has taken this approach, I think, is because of the belief in the scalability trilemma, in that there's a limit to how much transaction throughput can be squeezed out of a single blockchain without sacrificing decentralization or what was the third one?
Scalability, security, decentralization.
Right, security and decentralization. So what they're saying is that we don't want to sacrifice security and decentralization. And so we are going to increase scalability by instead having lots of app-specific blockchains. And that's how we're going to increase scalability. So, in practice, what we've seen is that, Cosmos was used for the Luna blockchain, of course, and there are other blockchains that use Cosmos to build their own ecosystem.
Yeah, the ethos of it feels very kind of open source, hackery, even like kind of Android-y to me, right? It feels almost to people who like modding things. Does that feel true to you?
Yeah, I think so. But I guess like another belief that I have is that, building your own blockchain is just fundamentally very hard. And I think it's very technically difficult. The degree of difficulty is quite high. I would say like building your own blockchain is like building a distributed database, but even more complex because there's kind of like the economics aspect of validator security. And a database, I would say, is like a 10-year project. And so building like a good L1 blockchain is, I would say, also kind of a 10-year project.
Spoken by a former database engineer himself, folks. And yeah, I guess I would say when I think about Cosmos, it seems like you're taking on this big hurdle that you don't really have to take on to build on Cosmos in a lot of cases. But it does appeal potentially to these types of folks who love customizing everything. I think there's a certain type of person who likes building their own PC just to build their own PC because it's cool, right? But you can just buy one off the shelf and actually most of the time, it's going to be pretty much 99% of the way there. But yeah, just my 2 cents. The next one that I want to touch on, I think we actually touched on earlier, but Binance Smart Chain.
Yeah, so I would say Binance Smart Chain is also it exists because of the idea of the scalability trilemma, right? It says we are going to sacrifice decentralization so that we can increase scalability while maintaining security. And so what they've done is it's quite simple. They just took Ethereum 1, the original version that uses proof of work. They ripped out proof of work. And instead of having a global network of individually operated validators or miners, I don't know the exact numbers, but my guess is they just have 3 validators in one AWS server somewhere. And that allows BSC to run a lot faster than Ethereum.
Yeah. So I guess if you ask, why wouldn't you choose BSC to build your DeFi applications? The answer is that it's essentially not DeFi if it's on BSC, right? It's Binance Finance, not decentralized finance. Anything to add there?
I suppose I used to be bewildered by, why people would build on BSC, but I suppose I'm a lot more.
It's the sweet yield.
Yeah, it's the sweet yields. I suppose at the end of the day, if there are sweet yields to be had, then why not? I suppose.
The success of BSC is just a testament to a lot of the fact that a lot of people are just in it for the money, right? And I think that's just a reality of crypto. Like you get folks who are really in it for the ideals and really care about building a decentralized system that gives power back to the people, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have folks who are just reaping sweet yields and staking cake and syrup and God knows what. But I think it's also a pretty interesting example of emergent behavior, BSC, right? It's like, you make this chain, you put all these like pretty rabbits and pancakes on it. And as long as there's money to be made, people will just kind of like have the fun and games. And that is arguably okay. But yeah, I want to touch on one more. And this one I'm laughing already. But before we get on to the discussion of, the one that we chose, but Cardano.
Yeah, I mean, I think Cardano had the same problem that Dfinity had, which is that they focused too much on kind of like R&D and at the end of the day they just didn't really have the ability to execute and build a blockchain that developers actually cared about. Interestingly, Cardano and Dfinity were both founded by folks that were very early in Ethereum, and I think that they kind of like left Ethereum, and I suppose they wanted to prove that they could kind of like build something better than Ethereum. But, here we are now.
This is another example, I think, also, though, of like the power of marketing and the power of branding and belief, given that Cardano is still very much on at least retail investors' minds if you look at market caps. And I think that's one that's pretty interesting to see how the reaction differs when you talk to just like the average person with passing knowledge of blockchain versus someone who's actually building in the space. But without further ado, I want to talk about Solana. I think we've talked a little bit about this before on the podcast, but why, as someone who, when I met him, probably would have identified, or I would have identified you as an Ethereum maxi, are you so bullish on Solana?
So I still am a huge believer in Ethereum's mission to build a world computer. A lot of the social values that Ethereum has, or, at least initially had kind of like earlier on. I think the reason why Solana is interesting is really simple. It has been able to achieve much higher transaction throughput. I think right now it's doing like 3,500 transactions per second. I think half of it is for the consensus network. So, 1,500 or so transactions per second that users are submitting, which is just orders of magnitude higher than Ethereum, which is, let's say it's doing like 10 to 20. And it's been able to kind of like be still decentralized if you look at kind of the diversity of validators on mainnet. And in my view, kind of like what it shows is that the scalability trilemma, at least the way that it was presented, originally in like 2018, was like not particularly true. And that it is actually possible to build a much faster blockchain just by essentially introducing new ideas from kind of like a pure computer engineering perspective.
Personally, I totally agree and have been really excited to see this thesis that you had really early on take off. When we started building on Solana, there were literally no apps on Solana, right? So I think it took a pretty deep understanding of the technology and also of like the developer ecosystem to see that it was going to grow and become something of relevance. But I do want to address a common question or criticism that people have of Solana, which is it really decentralized?
Yeah, so if you look at the distribution of validators that you can check, if you look for the Solana Beach Explorer, it'll show basically the top validators by stake on Solana. And I think last time I checked, you need like the top 20 or top 30 validators to reach 33% of the total stake. And if you compare that to, let's say, like Ethereum ETH2 right now, I think in ETH2, it's like 3 to 5 validators make up the top 33%. So in that sense, it's way more decentralized. It's way more distributed. So I think even that alone is just proof that Solana is actually quite distributed or decentralized.
One more thing, that's worth addressing when, it's a question that we actually get a lot when we meet people at real life events, I think. How do you think about the recent Solana outages? I think there have been several over the past year, and that's probably the number one thing that's actually scaring people away from building on Solana right now.
I think it's totally valid to have pause by seeing the outages. in my personal view, they are not fundamental flaws in the design of Solana. I don't really see fundamental flaws there, and that we'll see stability in the network. And that we've already started to see stability in the network. Essentially, some of the improvements that they've made with the peer-to-peer network in Solana have solved these things. And so the way I see it is like, are these like fundamental flaws in like the architecture, or are they just like things that can be fixed? Are they bugs that can be fixed? Or is there like a reasonable path to improve everything? And in my view, I think there are reasonable paths to improve the Solana network. And, we've actually already seen that in the last 6 months.
But what exactly are the bugs? Like, where are the bugs? Are they in the network's code itself? Like, are they on the validator side?
Both, I would say. I think if I recall, one of the fundamental issues is definitely the fact that the transaction costs are so low that it is relatively easy to DOS the network, or, like spam validators with transactions, and then cause the validators to essentially break because, it can't process that many transactions at once. Anatoly actually kind of like laid it out quite nicely a few months ago, I think like 3 months or so ago, about kind of the steps that they're planning on taking. But I guess at a high level, it's kind of similar to, let's say, like the email spam problem that internet infrastructure companies have like mostly solved. I suppose that's not maybe like the best analogy because I still get spam for the most part. But essentially, the idea is like increasing the cost of submitting transactions to the point where it becomes more difficult to kind of like break a validator.
Right. So I guess long story short is the core fundamental design of Solana is sound, and they're just working on actually the implementation to make it really ready for prime time. And that's something that just naturally takes time, right? I think it's important to remember that Solana has only been on mainnet for less than a handful of years, whereas, Ethereum's had a lot more time to become mature. But what's exciting about the crypto space is that there's always new development. And so just to close out generally, actually, our list of L1s for today, what are Sui and Aptos? And I hate to have to say this because I'm surprised to actually have heard this misconception often lately, but are they the same thing?
I would go back to what we were talking about previously real quick and say, going back to comparing an L1 to a distributed database, like a distributed database is a 10-year project. An L1 is also a 10-year project, in my opinion. And so I don't really expect Solana to be fully complete for at least 3 to 5 years. And that's when we'll start to see it become more mature. But yeah, like going to Sui and Aptos, they're not the same thing. I think they just happen to have, maybe not happen to have, but a lot of the folks on both teams originally came from Libra, which was kind of the Facebook blockchain that had a lot of hype in 2019.
So they're not the same thing. Gotcha. But then what are they? Maybe let's start with Aptos, since it just had a rather flashy launch on mainnet, an initial airdrop.
I'll start with kind of like the things that I've heard through the grapevine. This is like, don't take my word for it. But what everyone is essentially saying is that Aptos is kind of a less serious blockchain in comparison to Sui, although they both are similar in the sense that they originally came from Libra, and they're both similar in the sense that they raise large amounts at similar times. And I suppose I'll just leave it at that. This is kind of just hearsay, but I would say that from what I've observed from a distance, that seems to be mostly true. And in terms of like, what are the actual differences? I haven't looked at it enough, but for me personally, I haven't looked at Aptos seriously because it just doesn't really seem like a very serious attempt to build kind of a real blockchain.
What about Sui? I think this one's an interesting one since we literally just had a panel last week with the founder of Sui, Evan Chang. And so, yeah, curious what your take on Sui is.
Yeah, so I think Sui is definitely more interesting. In my mind, I would say that maybe there are two things that are interesting about it from a technical perspective. One is the consensus protocol, which, yeah, is definitely novel. And then the second one is the Move programming language. And I suppose I would say Aptos is supposed to be using Move as well, but I'm just going to focus on Sui. And the second thing that is interesting about it is like the Move programming language. So looking at the consensus protocol, I would say it introduces some interesting ideas. Although at the end of the day, I don't think that it is going to be necessarily a competitive advantage, especially compared to Solana. And what I mean by that is that, at the end of the day, what really matters is transaction throughput. I'm kind of skeptical of the ideas that they've introduced, specifically around differentiating between simple transactions that are similar to payments and more complex transactions that are used for smart contracts. They essentially split the two out and then use a much more simpler and faster consensus protocol for kind of the first category. And then for the second category, they do this like two-stage process where the first stage just solves the availability problem, which means they basically just determine what transactions will be included in the block, but then they don't order it. And then the second stage orders the transactions. And I've kind of looked at it. I do think it's interesting, and I'm kind of curious how it will perform on mainnet. But my intuition is that it's not going to allow the network to be much faster. So that's that with the consensus protocol. And then the second thing that makes it interesting is the Move programming language. And essentially what I've heard is that it's much easier to develop smart contracts on top of it, especially in comparison to kind of writing Rust on Solana. I definitely buy that idea. I do think that developing smart contracts on Solana can be fairly cumbersome. And so it's not surprising to hear that there's a much better programming language. I think the thing that will be challenging for Sui, though, is that their virtual machine, so basically like Sui's version of the EVM, it's not too different from Solana's virtual machine. And I think that Solana can essentially copy a lot of the good ideas that Sui has introduced that will improve the developer experience. And then it'll become more difficult for Sui to differentiate itself, at least compared to Solana. One other thing that I want to add with Sui and Aptos that I find interesting is that they both are obviously heavily influenced from Libra because a lot of the folks from both teams come from Libra. One thing I remember vividly about kind of like Libra's original designs is that, Libra was originally designed as a permissioned network, as in they essentially handpicked validators. And, it's not like anyone can participate as a validator. And the reason why they chose that was because they believed that, transaction throughput would not be high enough for kind of what they're imagining with a permissionless network. But I think basically what they saw was that they saw Solana and they saw that that was actually not true. And with basically pure computer engineering optimizations, you could actually have a fully permissionless network that has high transaction throughput. And you can kind of see that with at least like Sui's designs. Like they've clearly been inspired by, the way that the virtual machine works on Solana, and they've copied a lot of the ideas, for example, by requiring transactions, or I suppose like instructions to include, in Sui's case, the objects that are being read from and written to in order to optimize the execution. So to me, kind of like Sui and Aptos are both kind of, or at least Sui, I see as an iterative improvement to Solana. And so we'll see how that plays out.
So I guess if I were to summarize that, essentially the reasons that are still quite bullish on Solana is that it's really the only chain that's managed to demonstrate that it can actually satisfy all three needs outlined within the scalability trilemma, and additionally has been able to build a very robust developer ecosystem and like a fully fledged network, as well as I think like a lot of excitement in new areas like NFTs and now gaming. I think what is less well known and that Yutaro just touched on is that a lot of the technological improvements that Sui is introducing are potentially ones that could also be adopted by Solana. And so that, I would say, is really that combination is what leads us to still be bullish on Solana and to still be throwing all of our weight behind making Orca into the best crypto marketplace on Solana. But just to close out, I think we can just directly address the question of how does Orca think about building on multiple chains? And Yutaro, is there a case where you would ever choose to go build on another chain?
Yeah, ultimately, I would say that we're chain agnostic, as in we see kind of a future, maybe in a decade or so, where a significant amount of activity, like human activity, essentially, when it comes to transactions, are done on a blockchain. And we're kind of building for that world, right? And we want to build the best primitive possible for making transactions on this blockchain. So I think the way we think about it is like, okay, in 10 years, like where will these transactions happen? We don't think it's going to happen in L2 because L2s break composability. And I think composability is like one of the most important things that make blockchains themselves valuable. And we see Solana as having a very high probability of being the platform on top of which these transactions happen a decade from now. Having said that, things change all the time. Sui, it wasn't even on the map a year ago, right? And I think that it has a lot of potential. So I think ultimately we kind of want to build on the chain that has the highest probability of being the winning chain. And we're continuously monitoring everything that is going on. And we're also just making assessments on what's going on in the crypto industry.
Yeah, if I were to sum it up, I always say I'm not a crypto person, but really the reason I'm in this space building is just to build things that are of value to people. So regardless of what the base chain is, I think what's really important is that we are delivering that value. And that's something that I personally fervently believe we can currently do on Solana, but I'm definitely open-minded to seeing if there's another primitive that serves that need in the future. And so I think we've come up to almost about an hour here. So thank you guys for sticking with us for this double feature today. I think we covered a lot and hopefully it was of interest to a lot of people here. I know that L1s are always a popular topic for people breaking into crypto. So Taro, though I talk to you every single day, it feels a bit funny to say this, but thank you so much for coming on OrcaPod.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly, and maybe some people can learn a thing or two from kind of our conversations today. But thanks for having me.
Big-brained rambling, I'm sure, from the enigmatic founder himself. Don't you love that descriptor? I remember seeing someone saying the enigmatic Yutaro Mori. But yes, anyway, thank you everyone for tuning into OrcaPod. Keep a lookout for future content from Yutaro and myself. You can find Orca on Twitter at Orca_SO or join our Discord through the link in the show notes. It's been a splash.